In this video, we are going to be looking at Striker. Most importantly, we are going to be looking at the negative side of Striker. Now, of course, I'm going to be going over some of the pros of Striker as well. I'm going to be going over some, helpful tips, or at least some things that will help you get the most out of Striker. But I really want to stress the pitfalls that you can encounter when you're basically trying to build something around Striker. Now, many of us probably have fond memories, and others definitely have some negative memories from D1 on the classified Striker builds. The ability to have some of the most massive heals in the game, dealing some of the highest damage that could possibly be reached in an AR or an SMG. I mean, especially with the with the automatic shotgun there. There were some quirks there that really allowed that gear set to excel. Now, fast forward into Division 2, we've kind of seen that obviously, they had some worries about making a Striker gear set that was just too OP and would just conquer everything. In Division 2, there is plenty of options to buff your DPS. And because of this, Striker kind of feels a little bit old. It really doesn't have that same sparkle that it did in Division 1. And also, now that it's no longer classified and doesn't have that helpful healing ability to keep you in the fight, it really, comes down to a lot of different things to really keep those stacks alive. So what I've been basically doing the last couple days is just kind of comparing some Striker stuff to my, normal run-of-the-mill, almost fully maxed out DPS type builds. And pretty much what I've discovered is that Striker can be really strong, but on average, it's not as good as my regular, fully kitted out DPS builds. And some of the things that I want to point out to, anyone who's watching this, anyone who's interested in Striker, are just some of these negatives, some of these, unintended things that maybe you don't even think about, maybe you're not even, really aware of, or maybe, you just kind of thought wasn't really that important. Now, starting off with something pretty simple. All right, weapon RPM definitely matters when you're using Striker. Now I know it gets the slight rate of fire buff, but I just want to talk about just some basic stuff with weapons. Now, okay, without that RPM buff, let's talk about the AK. All right, if you're using the AK, you get 600 rounds per minute. Now, if you break that down into seconds, you're getting 10 rounds per second. That's basically your rate of fire, 10 rounds per second with the AK. Now, if you consider that if you hit all of those, those 10 shots on an enemy, you're going to be getting 10 stacks per second with an AK. I mean, that's not terrible, but I mean, it's not great either. Now, per second, you're going to be losing 2 stacks. So right there, you're going to be gaining about 8 stacks per second. Now, what we need to really talk about is accuracy. This is something that most people don't want to admit to or don't want to, really pay attention to. But on average, most people suck at shooting. You could be the biggest DPS fanboy, but the numbers generally say that most players hit in the 50% range. Now, I've seen players who are much worse, hitting in the 30 to 40% range. I've seen players hitting in the 20% range. I myself generally fall into the 60% range. But let's just say that miraculously players were shooting in the 80% range, okay? 10 stacks possible per second. You're already losing 2 stacks. So that means 8 stacks. Now, if you're shooting with a magical 80% accuracy, you are only going to be getting 6 stacks per second, because obviously missing 2 shots out of 10 is 8, and then losing 2 stacks is 6. So you're going to be getting 6 stacks per second, which is pretty terrible. Now, that doesn't even include, something like reload speed, or the enemy, hiding behind cover, or the fact that, they love to run around or just run away from you. They do their dancing and all this stuff. And that, of course, causes time to be, taken away from how fast you're building these stacks. So again, you're losing stacks because it's taking longer to kill enemies or find enemies. So, that doesn't even go into the fact of being shot at and actually having to, hide and cover, repair your armor before you can actually go back into the fight. That can eat up a lot of time and destroy a lot of stacks. honestly, if you are using a weapon that is probably below 800 RPM, you're probably not really doing that good in terms of building your stacks. Now, I don't say you have to. I mean, if you are really good at aiming, if you are really confident in the weapons that you use, or if you're using a secondary weapon to build the stacks and then, your primary weapon is just a little bit slower, that's fine. I mean, you just be aware of the problems that can occur if you're trying to build stacks with a very slow RPM weapon. Now, of course, some of those high RPM weapons do come with their own, handling quirks and accuracy quirks, and you might even, miss more shots than you were with the slower weapon. I mean, again, that's all on you. I'm just trying to help you be aware of some of these issues. All right. Now, another issue is, obviously, Striker does give you a buff to rate of fire, and it does give you a buff to weapon handling. But in most situations, that rate of fire negatively impacts your weapon handling more than that weapon handling buff does. Alright, so you are going to, even though you're getting the weapon handling, you're probably going to be less accurate just because your weapon's jumping a little bit more and a little bit faster. Alright, so you probably might end up having less accuracy than you would with the normal build. Now, another thing that's kind of very important with Striker is obviously the whole intention behind Striker is to gain stacks, which give you more damage, which help you kill enemies faster. As you get stronger and you're killing enemies faster, you're using less bullets to kill enemies. So the more damage that you do, the faster you kill them, the less stacks that you can actually build. So once you start getting towards the higher end of your stack range, it's going to be harder to actually maintain those stacks. So, this is a big negative if you're actually, trying to get the maximum amount of potential out of, your build. And another thing to consider with this is that if you are mostly a solo player, 75%, maybe even more of the enemies are rather weak. I mean, pretty much all of the red bars, they're pushovers. So if you're using a really strong DPS Striker build, you're going to be blowing through these enemies pretty much quicker than you can actually build stacks. I mean, you're going to have to, blow through an enemy, maybe you'll build 5 stacks, and then you're going to try to, aim in on another enemy and hope that you can, build up enough stacks on him before you can, then aim on another enemy and continue, so on and so forth. And this is obviously a huge problem because if you're trying to build stacks, but you're killing the enemies before you can really build anything, and then you're losing them all by the time you find another enemy to shoot, I mean, obviously, that's a huge issue. Now, this brings us to the great question of where can a Striker build excel? Now, obviously, as a solo player, your really, biggest source of building stacks is on bosses or on the, the heavies, the chungas, the tanks. Even sometimes the war dogs, you can build some good stacks on them, or even the shield guys, you can build stacks on them. But most other AI, you're probably going to blow through them too quickly. And for this reason, I generally say that the best place for a Striker build is probably in a 4-man group or in the raids. Probably more so the first raid, Dark Hours. Obviously, I think the second boss fight where you're fighting between the plane, forget the name of the actual boss there, but that fight you can build stacks pretty easily. All right, same thing with Buddy and Lucy, the 2 warhounds. You can build stacks on them really easily too. Even on the Razorback, I mean, hitting those objectives or the weak points or whatever you want to call them on Razorback, you can build stacks on that, and that's really good. And obviously the chungas that are trying to blow everything up, you can build stacks on them. So there are places there that you can build stacks. 4-man missions, obviously, just because of the scaling, the amount of health that they have, it's obviously a lot higher time to kill for an individual person shooting things. So if you have a kind of a mixed team with like healer, skill build, DPS, that kind of stuff, being a Striker build can be hugely beneficial to you, because obviously you're the sole source of that that pew pew, that that DPS build, and you have kind of unlimited potential to build these stacks on almost everything. And of course, legendary missions, again, great way for you to build stacks because the enemies are tanky enough, and usually there's a lot of gold bars and there's a lot of chungas. So I mean that can be a great place. But again, if you are a solo, if you want to get the most out of your build, honestly, I would suggest getting rid of a lot of your weapon damage. I'm not saying you have to lose all of your weapon damage, but again, the more weapon damage you have, the quicker you kill enemies, the less stacks you can build. So if you really wanted to go for a hybrid build, as a solo player, Striker does offer a lot of potential because you can build up a lot of stacks to get a lot of weapon damage. And you can also specialize more into skills or even armor. You can go, armor regen if you really want to go for more of a classy Striker feel. You can go more hybrid. You can just invest in an amalgamation of different things. But again, if you go all DPS as a solo build, you're going to be blowing through things way too quickly to even build stacks. And still, as I discovered, even if you do go kind of hybrid, you can still end up blowing through things way too quickly to build stacks. And I'm going to show you guys that, towards the end here. But, this is kind of the things that you really, want to pay attention to when you're actually using a Striker build. Because it can be strong, but it can also be very unimpressive, or at least never reach its full potential when you're playing, in certain encounters or certain missions or by yourself. Now, what I've actually chosen to do here with my Striker is kind of trying to go for a little bit of a skill hybrid. Now, this is probably not a new concept. Obviously, I'm way behind in the terms of, Striker builds. But for me, this is probably the most interesting way to build it. Now, I don't need all the weapon damage, but of course, coming back, I don't have exactly all the pieces that I would want. If I was to reevaluate this right now and go with the pieces that I would want, I'd probably want to have all yellows. However, I think that this build still actually probably out damages most heroic enemies as a solo player. Now, I know people cringe that, I'm using Memento. Obviously, Memento is one of the most used exotics right now. And that's just because, look, if you're trying to make a good build, intentionally avoiding a good piece is, in my opinion, just kind of dumb. If you are just trying to be different just for the sake of being different, that's okay. I can understand why, you just want to try something new. But to criticize, a build because it's using a piece that actually makes the build better, it's kind of silly, right? As a person who's building these builds to use them myself, I want to test it out in the best manner possible, right? I'm not saying that you have to use it. I'm just saying, if I'm going to make it, I want it to work. But Capacitor, just excels with the Striker build, and maybe even too much. Because again, what I talked about is you don't want all that weapon damage because then you can't really build those stacks. And Capacitor, of course, gets weapon damage off of skill tiers. So while it may seem like a good workaround, as I'll show you in the footage later, I still was doing too much damage to really keep stacks. And still doing too much damage to actually build stacks. So it's definitely kind of one of those conundrums where what do you do? Again, if you're going solo, like I already recommended, you probably want as little damage buffs as you can get, because you want to rely on that Striker stack to give you a huge damage boost, right? So you don't need all those other pieces. You can invest those into something else to give you, more survivability or, just more tankiness in general, more skill damage, whatever you want, right? And I think that's kind of the key to playing Striker as a solo player. You don't need all the damage. Find other ways to, get some interesting stuff out of the build. But again, yeah, having the skill tier from Tactician, having, the skill tier from Memento and the other, Striker rolls that I got on there, having that crit chance with the crit damage and, just the extra damage from Capacitor for all those skill tiers. It does put out some serious damage, especially once you get going. Now, of course, like I said, you're already putting out so much damage that you're not even really going to get going for most encounters. Now, I've gone with the Striker drone just because I think it kind of fits. Obviously, Striker and Striker drone seems like a good pair to me. The Assault Turret, definitely think it's a good pick. Now, obviously, those are just two really easy to use skills. I would like to go with some other skills. I thought about using the Seeker Mine and the Sticky Bomb. The problem with those is just that I have to invest in a lot of skill haste to really make those worth it. And of course, when you're having to aim and throw these things, you are, again, losing a good amount of time, right? If you're trying to, micromanage your seeker mine to hit the right target, or if you're trying to, aim right behind some cover to hit an enemy, obviously you're losing stacks, and that's not what you want to do. I kind of want to have this as a hands-off, skill approach. So having the turret do its thing and having the drone do its thing keeps me able to do my thing, which is shoot at enemies and build stacks. Now, obviously, they are going to be doing some damage and taking stacks away from me, but overall, I think what they provide in distraction, keeping the enemy from just always shooting at me, I think is a huge benefit, because that means that I don't have to sit and cover and lose stacks while I repair or just regen or whatever. So I think that's kind of, I think it evens itself out there. Now, again, the point of this video is not to reinvent the wheel. Obviously, I'm well aware that people have probably put together striker skill builds. The point of this video was kind of to explain why some things work and why some things probably don't. If you are building a full DPS striker build, going through a mission, and not paying attention, and you're just like, oh man, it's so easy, I'm just rocking everything. It's like, well, look at your stacks, record some of that footage. Look at your stacks as you're actually going through it. How often are you at full stacks? And, the question kind of remains is, how can you optimize that more? How can you get it so that you're actually building stacks, actually using, these stacks that Striker's giving you, and investing into something else? Because if you're not building stacks, then there's no real point in using Striker, right? If you're not building these stacks to get the damage, then you're kind of losing out on the whole point of the build. And you're probably just doing way too much damage, and it means that there's a lot of potential there for you to invest and do other things. Drop down that damage so that you're actually building these stacks, and then see what happens. I mean, if you are able to build these stacks and still do some good damage, and then you have a bunch of extra space left over for, armor regen, or hazard protection, or skill damage, or skill haste, I mean, you have a lot more, unlockable potential there. So that's pretty much the biggest thing to consider. I mean, if you don't get lucky and find a heavy in every room, you can't really build these stacks. I mean, these guys just fall over. At the end of the fight, I have maybe like 10 stacks. And that really indicates to me that I'm just doing way too much damage for most of the enemies around me on heroic. If I'm not building stacks after an encounter, it's very hard to say that I should be using it, right? And I mean, I understand that people might think, well, if you're, just blowing through everything, obviously the build's good. That's not the issue that I have. The issue that I have is optimization, right? If I'm making a build, I want it to be optimized. I want to get the most out of every piece that I can. And if I'm not getting all of those stacks, and if I can't fully build my stacks, to me it indicates that I'm doing already too much damage, and I have, plenty of room to invest into something else, right? Because if I could cut out some of my weapon damage, put on some more skill tiers, then maybe when I do finally get to those 100 stacks, I'll probably get at that same level of damage that I was already getting at, except now I have even more skill tier, or have more armor regen, So that's what it means to me. If I'm not constantly getting those stacks higher and higher and higher with every fight, I'm doing something wrong. So that's the way that I look at it. Now, some people may be like, well, I have all the damage that I need and extra in case I get into a boss fight. Yeah, that's a valid point, I guess, if you are, going through all of these missions just for a boss encounter. Or again, if you are going through, 4-man missions, right? Obviously, if you're going through 4-man missions, it requires a little bit different thought process than if you are going through it solo. So if you are going through it as a 4-man, yeah, you probably want to have a lot of extra damage because the enemies are just tankier. If you're going through the raid, again, you want to have extra damage because the enemies are tankier. If you're going through a legendary, the enemies are a lot tankier and you want to have all the damage you can get. So, I mean, it really just depends on the circumstance for how you're going to build to. Would I say using a hybrid striker on legendary is great? It's probably not optimal. Could you do it? Yeah. Would I say that you want to have an armor regen striker on legendary? Again, probably not. I mean, you know, it all depends on your team layout and everything, of course. Obviously, there's so many things to consider with Striker that, you know, I can't go over every possible circumstance. But, you know, a good helpful rule of thumb would be, you know, as a solo player, with Striker building these stacks, you probably don't need a bunch of extra wasted damage. And if you're going through Legendary, yeah, you probably want as much damage as you can get because that is probably more specialized to your role as a damage dealer. But anyway, I hope you guys got something out of this Striker video. I know I'm a little bit late to the party, but if, you know, you'd never really considered the pros and cons of Striker, I hope I did a good job here for you. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you in the next one.